Sometimes the world forgets you exist, leaving you invisible and alone. For 20 years, Mara has lived this way, in a small village, homeless, hungry, surviving on scraps while everyone looks through her like she's already dead. Tonight, she finds herself at a grand wedding feast, seated at the high table in fine clothes she doesn't understand. The other guests whisper and stare as she eats the first real meal she's had in months. Then the pale lord stands and raises his wineglass to make an announcement. He declares that his bride has finally arrived, and every eye turns to Mara. She realizes this mysterious lord has been watching her all along, waiting for the right moment to claim her. But why would someone so powerful want a woman the world threw away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Thornwick Village like the breath of sleeping ghosts. Mara Blackwood, though few remembered her surname anymore, pulled her threadbare cloak tighter around her shoulders as she made her way down the narrow alley behind the baker's shop. The wool had been fine once, deep blue like summer twilight, but 20 years of mending had turned it into a patchwork of memory and necessity. Each repair told a story, the tear from when she'd caught it on a blacksmith's fence while fleeing cruel children, the burn mark from sleeping too close to a baker's oven for warmth, the careful stitches that held together both fabric and dignity. Her bone needle, yellowed with age and worn smooth by countless hours of work, caught the early light as she examined a fresh rent in the cloak's hem. The needle had belonged to her grandmother, carved from the thigh bone of a deer her grandfather had taken during their first winter together. It was the last thing of value Mara owned, though its worth lay not in gold but in the steady rhythm of survival it provided. Another cold night, was it? The voice belonged to Agnes Whitmore, the baker's wife, whose kindness had kept Mara alive through more winters than either woman cared to count. Agnes emerged from her back door carrying a steaming loaf wrapped in clean linen, her plump face creased with the particular worry that comes from watching someone slowly fade away. "No worse than usual," Mara replied, accepting the bread with practiced grace. She had learned long ago not to appear too grateful, lest kind souls like Agnes feel obligated to do more than they could afford. "Your husband's bread grows better each season. The whole village speaks of it." Agnes smiled, though her eyes remained troubled. At 53, Mara had aged beyond her years. Her once auburn hair now streaked with silver, her hands roughened by work and weather. But her bearing remained straight, her voice cultured despite her circumstances. This dignity puzzled the villagers who had known her only as a homeless woman, though the older residents sometimes whispered about the lady who had once lived in the manor on Windrose Hill. "There's talk in the village," Agnes said carefully, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Strange happenings up at Ravencroft Keep. Lights in windows that have been dark for generations. The new lord arrived 3 days past, they say." Mara paused in her examination of the bread's warmth. Ravencroft Keep had stood empty for nearly 30 years, ever since the last lord had died without heir. The massive stone fortress perched on the cliff overlooking the valley like a sleeping dragon, its towers lost in mist more often than not. "What manner of man takes residence in such a place?" Mara asked, though something deep in her chest tightened with an emotion she couldn't name. It felt almost like recognition, though she had never seen the new lord. "That's just it, nobody's seen him proper. Arrives after dark, speaks to no one save his servants. But gold flows like water from that keep. Now, Marcus the butcher delivered 3 whole sides of beef yesterday, paid in coin so bright it might have been minted by angels." Agnes lowered her voice. "They say he's young, this new lord, pale as winter moonlight and twice as cold." A chill ran down Mara's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had felt watched lately, particularly during her evening walks when she gathered herbs by moonlight. The sensation of eyes upon her had grown stronger each night, though she had attributed it to her imagination, or perhaps the village boys playing cruel games. Young lords rarely concern themselves with village affairs, Mara said, though her voice lacked conviction. I'm sure he'll settle into the usual pattern soon enough. Agnes studied her with the shrewd gaze of a woman who had raised 6 children and buried a husband. You've felt it too, haven't you? That sense of something changing. Before Mara could respond, the harsh voice of Garrett Ironhold cut through the morning quiet. The merchant rounded the corner, his expensive boots clicking against the stones with the self-importance of a man who measured worth in gold pieces. Still feeding strays, Agnes? Garrett's lip curled in distaste as his gaze fell upon Mara. The town council has discussed this matter. We cannot have vagrants cluttering our streets, particularly with a new lord in residence. It reflects poorly on all of us. Agnes straightened to her full height, flour-dusted hands finding her hips. Mara Blackwood is no vagrant, Garrett Ironhold, and well you know it. She earns her keep with honest work. Honest work? Garrett laughed, though the sound held no humor. What honest work can a woman of her station perform? She mends rags for copper pennies and sleeps in doorways like a common beggar. The words stung because they held truth, but Mara had learned to armor herself against such casual cruelty. She had been a lady once, mistress of servants and lands, but that life belonged to another woman in another time. This woman, the one who stood in Baker's alleyways accepting charity, had earned her place through 20 years of quiet endurance. My needlework speaks for itself, Mara said quietly, as does the honesty with which I conduct my affairs. Needlework? Garrett spat the word like poison. The new lord will expect better standards than a homeless seamstress can provide. Perhaps it's time you moved along to another village, one more suited to your circumstances. The threat hung in the air like incense, heavy and bitter. Mara had heard such suggestions before, though usually whispered behind cupped hands rather than spoken with Garrett's bold malice. She understood the unspoken truth. Without protection, without family or position, she existed at the sufferance of others. That's quite enough, Garrett. Father Benedict emerged from the shadow of the church steps, his brown robes rustling as he approached. The priest was younger than Mara, barely 40, but his gentle manner had earned respect throughout Thornwick. The Lord teaches us charity toward those in need, not judgment. Garrett's expression soured further. Charity has its limits, Father. We cannot support every unfortunate soul who wanders into Thornwick. Mara has lived here for 20 years, Father Benedict replied calmly. She has harmed none and helped many with her skills. I see no reason she should not continue to do so. As the three debated her fate, Mara felt that strange sensation again, the weight of unseen eyes upon her. She glanced toward the hillside, where Ravencroft Keep brooded against the grey sky, its towers wreathed in morning mist. For just a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at one of the high windows, but when she blinked, there was nothing but shadow and stone. The conversation continued around her, but Mara's attention had shifted to something far more pressing than Garrett's threats. A young boy came running down the main street, his face flushed with excitement and terror in equal measure. "Father Benedict, Master Ironhold, come quickly!" The boy stumbled to a halt before them, clutching a stitch in his side. "Lady Catherine, Lord Aldrich's daughter, she's to be married tomorrow. The banns were read this morning, and the whole village is invited to feast." The announcement struck like lightning among the small group. Lady Catherine was barely 18, beautiful and well-educated, the prize of the county. Every young lord for 50 miles had sought her hand, but her father had been remarkably selective about suitors. "Married? To whom?" Agnes demanded. The girl had no betrothed last week. The boy's eyes widened with the importance of his news. "To the new lord of Ravencroft Keep. The wedding feast is tomorrow evening, and every soul in Thornwick is commanded to attend." Even his gaze flicked nervously to Mara. "Even the poorest among us are welcome at the Lord's table." A profound silence fell over the group. Such invitations were unheard of. Weddings were typically private affairs among the nobility, with perhaps a handful of favored villagers permitted to witness the ceremony from a respectful distance. Every soul, Father Benedict repeated carefully. Every soul, the boy confirmed. The new lord's exact words. According to the messenger, he said the joy of new love should be shared by all who dwell within his lands. Garrett scoffed. Romantic nonsense. Though, I suppose it shows proper lordly generosity. His gaze turned calculating as he considered the business opportunities such largesse might represent. But Mara felt something else entirely, a strange certainty that this invitation was meant specifically for her. The feeling made no logical sense. She had never spoken to Lord Aldrich's daughter, never even seen the new lord of Ravencroft Keep. Yet something deep in her bones whispered that tomorrow night would change everything. "You'll attend, won't you, Mara?" Agnes asked with gentle concern. A feast would do you good, and the invitation was quite clear. "I have nothing suitable to wear to a lordly wedding," Mara replied, though even as she spoke, she knew she would find a way. The pull she felt toward tomorrow evening was too strong to ignore. "Nonsense," Father Benedict said kindly. "The church keeps garments for those in need. I'm certain we can find something appropriate." As the group dispersed to spread the remarkable news, Mara remained in the alley, staring up at the distant keep. The morning mist was clearing, and she could see the ancient walls more clearly now. Ravencroft Keep had always seemed imposing, but today it appeared almost expectant, as though the stones themselves were waiting for something to begin. She touched the bone needle in her pocket, feeling its familiar smoothness. Tomorrow night she would attend a wedding feast, though she could not shake the feeling that she was walking toward a fate that had been written long before her birth. The bread in her hands had grown cold, but its warmth had already spread through her chest, mingling with something that felt dangerously like hope. For 20 years, she had been invisible, forgotten, dismissed. Tomorrow night, surrounded by nobility and fine clothes, she would still be those things. Yet something whispered that she was wrong, that invisibility was about to become impossible, that the eyes she felt watching her belonged to someone who saw her more clearly than she saw herself. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of roses and something else, something dark and rich and ancient. Mara pulled her mended cloak closer and began the long walk back to her shelter, unaware that high above in Ravencroft Keep, a pale figure watched her progress with the intensity of a hunter who had finally found his prey. Tomorrow night would indeed change everything. The question was whether Mara would survive the transformation. The great hall of Ravencroft Keep blazed with more light than it had seen in 3 decades. Hundreds of candles flickered in iron sconces along the stone walls, their flames dancing like trapped spirits, eager for freedom. The massive hearth roared with oak logs, thick as a man's waist, casting shifting shadows across tapestries that depicted ancient hunts and forgotten battles. Long tables groaned beneath the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, wheels of cheese, and flagons of wine that gleamed like liquid rubies in the firelight. Mara stood at the threshold of the great hall, overwhelmed by the transformation that had befallen her. The simple brown dress Father Benedict had provided from the church stores had somehow become a gown of midnight blue velvet, soft as a whisper against her skin. Her weathered hands, usually stained with work, were now smooth and pale, as if years had fallen away like discarded veils. Even her hair, typically hidden beneath her patched hood, now fell in silver-touched waves around her shoulders. She touched her throat uncertainly, feeling the absence of her usual coarse neckcloth. In its place hung a pendant she did not remember, donning a stone that caught the candlelight and held it like captured moonbeams. The transformation felt like magic, though she told herself such things belonged to children's tales. "Welcome, my lady." A servant appeared beside her, dressed in livery of deep crimson and black. His manner was respectful, even reverent, as though she were nobility rather than a homeless woman who had arrived at the keep's gates an hour past sunset. "Your seat awaits at the high table," The high table. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She had expected to find a place among the village folk at the lower tables, if she were welcomed at all. The high table was reserved for family, honored guests, and those of noble blood. She opened her mouth to protest, but the servant had already begun to guide her forward through the throng of wedding guests. The hall buzzed with conversation and laughter, yet as Mara passed, voices fell to whispers. She caught fragments of speculation and confusion. Nobody recognized the elegant woman being escorted to the place of honor, though many remembered the homeless seamstress who mended their clothes for copper coins. Lady Catherine sat at the center of the high table, resplendent in white silk embroidered with pearls that caught the light like fallen stars. She was beautiful as a summer morning, with golden hair and roses in her cheeks, yet something in her blue eyes spoke of resignation rather than joy. Her new husband had not yet appeared, though his chair stood ready beside hers, a massive throne-like seat carved from black oak and inlaid with silver. Lord Aldrich rose as Mara approached, his weathered face creased with confusion and barely concealed concern. He was a man of 60 years, grey-bearded and dignified, who had ruled his lands with wisdom and fairness. Yet tonight he seemed diminished, as though some vital force had been drained from him. "My lady," he said carefully, his voice carrying across the hall with the weight of long practice. "We are honored by your presence, though I confess I am uncertain of your identity." Before Mara could respond, the great doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a sound like thunder. The conversations died instantly, leaving only the crackle of flames and the soft whisper of fabric as every person in the hall turned toward the entrance. The man who entered moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step measured and purposeful. He was tall and lean, dressed in robes of deepest crimson that seemed to drink the candlelight rather than reflect it. His hair was dark as a winter night, and his skin possessed the pale perfection of carved marble. But it was his eyes that held Mara captive. Ancient eyes, the color of winter storms, filled with knowledge that spoke of centuries rather than decades. He moved through the hall as though he owned not merely the keep but the very air within it. Nobles and common folk alike stepped aside without conscious thought, creating a clear path to the high table. When his gaze found Mara, she felt the impact like a physical blow. Those storm-grey eyes widened slightly, and for just a moment his perfect composure cracked to reveal something that might have been relief or perhaps triumph. "Forgive my lateness," he said, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall despite its quiet tone. There was music in that voice, dark and rich as aged wine. "I was ensuring that all preparations were complete for this most joyous occasion." He approached the high table with predatory grace, but instead of taking his place beside his young bride, he moved to where Mara stood, frozen by her assigned chair. The silver goblet at his place setting rose from the table without his touch, floating through the air to settle gently in his outstretched hand. Several guests gasped at this display of impossible power, though none dared speak. The goblet was a masterwork of ancient craftsmanship, engraved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the dancing candlelight. As Mara stared at the intricate patterns, she felt a strange recognition, as though she had seen these marks before in dreams or half-forgotten memories. "My lords and ladies, good people of Thornwick," the pale lord said, raising the silver goblet high above his head. The wine within caught the light like liquid fire, though Mara could have sworn the vessel had been empty moments before. "Tonight we celebrate not merely the joining of two hearts, but the return of one who has been long lost." The hall held its breath. Lady Catherine's face had gone white as her wedding gown, and her father's hand moved instinctively to the sword that was not there. Weapons being forbidden at wedding. "Feasts. I present to you my chosen bride," the Lord continued, his storm-grey eyes never leaving Mara's face. "She who has wandered in shadow for 20 years, who has known hunger and cold and the casual cruelty of a world that had forgotten her worth. She who has endured all trials with grace and dignity intact. The gasps that rose from the assembled guests were like the sound of wind through autumn leaves. Every eye in the hall turned to Mara, who stood paralyzed by shock and growing terror. This was impossible. She was nobody, nothing, a woman the world had discarded. This pale lord with his ancient eyes and impossible powers could not be speaking of her. "My lord," she whispered, though her voice seemed to carry further than a whisper should. "Surely there has been some mistake. I am not, you are exactly who you have always been," he interrupted gently, stepping closer until she could feel the coldness that emanated from his skin like winter fog. Mara of the silver eyes and the unbroken spirit, Mara who mends what others have torn, who finds beauty in broken things. My bride, my queen, my heart's desire restored to me at last. The silver goblet in his hand began to glow with inner light, and the wine within turned from red to silver to something that seemed to hold starlight itself. Around them, the candles flickered in unison, their flames bending toward the pair at the high table as though drawn by an invisible force. "Drink with me," the Lord commanded softly, extending the goblet toward her. "Seal the bond that was written in stars long before this night began." Mara's hand trembled as she reached for the vessel, though she could not say whether it was from fear or anticipation. The metal was warm despite the coldness that surrounded its master, and when their fingers touched, she felt a shock of recognition so profound it nearly brought her to her knees. Images flashed through her mind herself in other gowns, in other centuries, standing beside this same man in halls that crumbled to dust ages past. She saw herself dancing in moonlight, walking through gardens where roses bloomed black as midnight, lying in chambers where shadows moved with lives of their own. Impossible, she breathed, but even as she spoke she knew it was not. The bone needle in her pocket, her grandmother's needle, grew warm against her leg, and suddenly she remembered her grandmother's stories of the old blood, the ancient families who had walked between worlds when the earth was younger. "Drink," the Lord repeated, and this time his voice held the weight of command that could not be denied. "Remember who you were, who you are, who you shall become." Lady Catherine made a small sound of distress, and her father half rose from his chair. But neither could move against the power that filled the air like honey, thick and golden and inescapable. The wedding guests sat frozen in their seats, witnesses to something far beyond their understanding. Mara lifted the goblet to her lips and drank deeply. The liquid tasted of starlight and silver, of roses and rain, and the wild magic that had once run freely through the world. As it flowed through her, she felt 20 years of weariness fall away like shed skin. Her true self, the self she had buried beneath survival and resignation, began to emerge like a butterfly from its chrysalis. The pale lord smiled then, and for the first time in 3 centuries, genuine warmth touched those ancient eyes. "Welcome home, my beloved," he whispered, and the words echoed through the hall like a blessing and a curse combined. The wedding feast had become something else entirely, a claiming, a restoration, a return to a truth that had been hidden for far too long. And as Mara looked into those storm-grey eyes, she knew with absolute certainty that her old life was over and something far stranger and more dangerous had begun. The carriage that bore Mara away from Ravencroft Keep's great hall moved without horses, gliding through the moonlit countryside as though carried by shadows themselves. She pressed her face to the window, watching the familiar landmarks of her exile fade into silver-touched darkness. 20 years she had walked these roads on foot, begging shelter in barns and doorways, and now she travelled as a lady, though, toward what fate she could not say. Across from her sat the pale lord, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the moonlight with an intensity that suggested they generated their own illumination. He had introduced himself simply as Lucian Ravencroft, though she sensed that neither name was the whole truth. Everything about him spoke of ages beyond human reckoning, from the archaic formality of his speech to the way he held himself with the stillness of carved stone. "You have questions," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like silk through steel. It was not a question but a statement, delivered with the confidence of one who had grown accustomed to reading the thoughts of mortals. "I have nothing but questions," Mara replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The silver wine still coursed through her veins, bringing with it a clarity she had not possessed for decades. "Beginning with why you would claim a homeless woman as your bride before half the county." A smile played at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. "You are many things, Mara Blackwood, but homeless is not one of them. You have simply been away from your true home for far longer than either of us intended." The pendant at her throat grew warm, pulsing gently like a second heartbeat. As she touched it with wondering fingers, she realized it was responding to his presence, growing brighter when he spoke her name. The stone was unlike anything she had seen, neither fully transparent nor completely opaque, but something that existed between states of being. "This belonged to you once," Lucian said, noting her fascination with the pendant. "As did many things you have forgotten. The moonstone remembers, even when memory fails. It has waited centuries for your return." "Centuries." Mara's laugh held little humor. "My lord, I have lived but 53 years, and I remember every one of them. There are no missing centuries in my past." "Are there not?" His eyes held hers with hypnotic intensity. "Tell me, dear Mara, what do you remember of your childhood before the age of 10? The question struck her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again as she realized the memories simply were not there. She could recall her grandmother teaching her to sew, could picture the cottage where they had lived, but the faces were blurred, the details swimming just beyond reach. "Memory is a fragile thing," Lucian continued gently, "particularly for souls that have worn many forms across many lifetimes. The moonstone preserves what the mind cannot bear to hold." The carriage began to climb a winding road she did not recognize, though something about the landscape seemed familiar in the way of half-remembered dreams. Ancient oaks lined their path, their branches interwoven overhead to form a tunnel of silver and shadow. Mist rose from the ground in spirals that moved against the wind, and she caught glimpses of lights that flickered between the trees, too pale to be fireflies, too purposeful to be random. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "Home," he replied simply, "to Castle Nightmere, where you belonged before the world grew young and forgot the old ways." As they crested the hill, Mara saw their destination spread before them like a vision from a fairy tale. Castle Nightmere rose from a lake of mist, its towers reaching toward the star-swept sky with ethereal grace. Unlike Ravencroft Keep's brooding stone, this structure seemed to be built from moonlight itself, its walls pale and luminous as pearl. Gardens surrounded it in perfectly ordered beauty, where roses bloomed in midnight blues and purples that had no names in mortal tongues. "It's beautiful," she whispered, then immediately felt foolish for the inadequacy of the word. "It has waited for your return to show its true splendor," Lucian said, and she heard something in his voice that might have been longing. "For 300 years, these halls have stood empty of the light that gives them meaning." The carriage drew to a halt before gates that opened at their approach without visible mechanism. Servants appeared as though conjured from the mist itself, pale figures in midnight blue livery who bowed deeply as Lucian handed Mara from the carriage. Their faces were ageless in the way of porcelain dolls, beautiful but somehow distant from full humanity. "Welcome home, my lady," they murmured in voices like wind through silver bells. "We have prepared your chambers according to your preferences." "My preferences?" Mara looked to Lucian in confusion. "But I have never been here before. Have you not?" He offered his arm, and she found herself taking it despite the chill that emanated from his skin through his fine clothes. "Perhaps you will find that some preferences transcend single lifetimes." They passed through the great doors into a hall that took her breath away. The ceiling soared overhead, painted with constellations that moved in slow, hypnotic patterns. Fountains played in alcoves carved from living rock, their waters singing harmonies that seemed to speak directly to her soul. And everywhere, covering every surface in intricate patterns, were roses carved in stone, woven in tapestries, growing in crystal vases where they bloomed without soil or sun. "You loved roses," Lucian explained, following her wondering gaze. "In every incarnation, in every lifetime we shared, you surrounded yourself with their beauty. I confess I have indulged the memory perhaps excessively. A memory stirred not of roses themselves, but of the feeling they evoked. Peace, beauty in the midst of thorns, love that persisted despite the certainty of fading. She could almost see herself in these halls, younger and dressed in gowns of silk instead of patched wool, but the image wavered like heat shimmer whenever she tried to focus on it. "How many lifetimes?" she asked quietly. "7," he replied without hesitation. "7 times you have been born. 7 times we have found each other. 7 times fate has torn us apart. But this time will be different. This time, I will not let mortal concerns steal you away." They climbed a sweeping staircase, where the banister was carved with vines that seemed to grow beneath her fingers as she touched them. The servants followed at a respectful distance, carrying chests and trunks that must have come from somewhere, though Mara had brought nothing with her save the clothes on her back. "I don't understand any of this," she said, as they reached a corridor lined with portraits. The paintings showed couples throughout the ages, medieval lords and ladies, Renaissance nobles, Victorian aristocrats. But in every image, the man bore Lucian's unmistakable features, while the women, though different in colouring and dress, shared something essential in their faces, something that looked remarkably like her own reflection. "Understanding will come with time," Lucian assured her, stopping before a door of polished ebony. "For now, know only that you are safe, that you are cherished, and that you are exactly where you belong." The door opened to reveal chambers that defied possibility. The sitting room was larger than any cottage Mara had ever seen, furnished with chairs and tables that seemed to have grown rather than been crafted. A fire burned in a hearth carved with the same rose motifs that decorated the rest of the castle, though no wood fueled the dancing flames. Through tall windows, she could see gardens where night blooming, flowers glowed like captured stars. "Your belongings have been prepared," Lucian said, gesturing to wardrobes that stood open to reveal gowns of every conceivable fabric and hue. "Though I suspect you may find them remarkably familiar." As if drawn by invisible threads, Mara moved to touch one of the gowns, a creation of midnight velvet embroidered with silver roses. The moment her fingers brushed the fabric, she was overwhelmed by the sensation of having worn it before, of dancing in it through halls filled with music and laughter and love. "This is impossible," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction. "Impossible," Lucian agreed softly from behind her. "Like love that transcends death, like souls that find each other across centuries, like hope that endures through lifetimes of separation." The moonstone pendant pulsed against her throat, warm and reassuring, as though trying to convince her that some impossible things were merely truths waiting to be remembered. Mara woke the next evening to find the world transformed by twilight's embrace. She had slept through the entire day, her body exhausted by revelations that defied everything she thought she knew about herself. The chambers that had seemed dreamlike in the previous night's candlelight now revealed themselves in greater detail as servants moved silently about, lighting candles that burned with flames of blue and silver. On the bedside table sat a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless hands and marked with the same symbols that had adorned Lucian's silver goblet. The leather was deep burgundy, nearly black, and bound with silver clasps that opened at her touch as though they recognized her fingers. "His lordship thought you might find this illuminating," said a servant whose name, Mara recalled, was Elisande. The woman appeared to be perhaps 30 years of age, with the pale beauty common to all the castle's inhabitants and eyes like winter starlight. It contains his thoughts from across the centuries of your separation. Mara opened the journal with trembling hands. The pages were filled with script that changed style and language as the entries progressed, sometimes Latin, sometimes languages she did not recognize, occasionally the familiar curves of English, though spelled in archaic fashion. Yet somehow, impossibly, she could read every word as though they were written in her native tongue. Asterisk 1523. She is gone again. Isabella died bearing our child, and with her died my hope that this time might be different. The babe followed her into death before drawing a single breath. I have searched for signs of her rebirth, but the world remains empty of her presence. I will wait. I have learned patience in these dark centuries. Asterisk 1612. Found her in a convent outside Florence. Sister Margaret, they called her, devoted to God and charitable works. She remembered nothing of our previous life, but her soul recognized mine. We had 3 years of happiness, before the plague took her. 3 years from a lifetime of waiting. It is not enough. It will never be enough. Asterisk 1798. Lady Catherine Windermere, married to a baron twice her age. She died in childbirth, as seems to be her fate whenever we find earthly happiness. I begin to suspect that mortal love itself is our curse, that the very act of union dooms her to death. Asterisk 1889. Victoria Mason, a governess in London. This time I remained distant, watching over her from afar, hoping that perhaps if I did not claim her, she might live a full mortal span. She died at 93, surrounded by children she had taught and loved. She lived, but we were never truly together. I do not know which pain is greater, losing her to death or losing her to the limitations of a single mortal lifetime. Asterisk 1923. Margaret O'Brien, an Irish seamstress. The pattern holds always. She is drawn to mending, to healing broken things. She died in the influenza outbreak, but not before she whispered my name with her final breath. Some part of her always remembers, even when the conscious mind has forgotten. Asterisk. The entries continued, painting a picture of love that spanned centuries and lives, of a man who watched the woman he loved die again and again while he remained unchanged by time. Mara's hands shook as she read of her own deaths, of children born and lost, of brief moments of happiness shadowed by inevitable sorrow. He has loved you longer than most mortals have existed, Elisande said gently. The pain of losing you has nearly driven him to madness more than once. This time he is determined that things will be different. How can they be? Mara whispered, closing the journal. If I am mortal, as these entries suggest, then I will age and die as I always have. How does claiming me openly change that fate? Perhaps, Elisande said carefully, mortality is not as fixed as mortals believe. Before Mara could ask what that meant, a soft knock sounded at the chamber door. Lucien entered without waiting for permission, moving with that predatory grace that marked him as something other than human. Tonight he wore simpler clothes, a shirt of white linen open at the throat, dark breeches, boots that made no sound on the stone floor. The casual attire made him seem more approachable, though no less dangerous. "You have been reading my confessions?" he observed, noting the journal in her hands. "I hope they have not distressed you overmuch." "Distressed?" Mara laughed, though the sound held little humor. "I have learned that I have died 7 times in the arms of the man who claims to love me, that I have borne children who died before they could know life, That I am apparently trapped in some cosmic cycle of reincarnation that brings me nothing but pain. Distressed seems inadequate to describe my feelings. Lucian moved to the window, staring out at gardens where impossible flowers bloomed in the eternal twilight he maintained around the castle. "You focus on the deaths," he said quietly. "But what of the love? What of the moments of joy we shared? Are they meaningless simply because they were brief? They are meaningless if they always end the same way. Then you understand why I have decided that this time must be different." He turned from the window, and she saw something implacable in his ancient eyes. "Why I will not allow mortality to claim you again." A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering directly, he approached the bed where she sat, moving with careful deliberation. When he reached for her hand, she did not pull away, though his skin was cold as winter morning against hers. "In all our previous lives together, I respected your humanity," he said, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "I allowed you to live and die as mortals do, hoping that perhaps love alone would be sufficient to break whatever curse kept us apart. But love, I have learned, is not always enough." "Lucian, I am not mortal, Mara. I have not been mortal for over 1,000 years. I am what your people call vampire, though the word carries connotations that do not fully encompass what I have become. I do not hunger for blood as the legends suggest, though I can draw life from it when necessary. I am sustained by older magics, by powers that existed before mankind learned to fear the dark." The revelation should have terrified her, but instead she felt only a strange sense of completion, as though the last piece of a puzzle had finally been fitted into place. It explained his coldness, his agelessness, the impossible beauty of his castle and servants. "And you wish to make me like you," she said, surprised by her own calm. "I wish to give you the choice I should have offered centuries ago," he corrected. "To join me in immortality, to break the cycle that has kept us apart, to become what you were always meant to be. And if I refuse?" His hand tightened on hers, and for a moment she glimpsed the predator beneath the courtly exterior. "Then you will live out this mortal life as you choose, and I will wait for your next incarnation as I have waited before. But I will not pretend that such waiting has not nearly destroyed me." The honesty in his voice cut deeper than threats could have. She could see the centuries of loneliness in his eyes, the pain of watching love die again and again while he remained untouched by time. Whatever he was, whatever darkness lived within him, his love for her was real and profound and terrible in its intensity. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Time you shall have," he agreed, raising her hand to his lips. His kiss was cold fire against her skin. "But do not take too long, my beloved. There are forces in this world that would see us parted once again, and I will not face another century of emptiness." As he left her alone with her thoughts and the weight of an impossible decision, Mara touched the moonstone pendant at her throat. It pulsed with warm light, and for just a moment she thought she heard an echo of her own voice from across the centuries, whispering words of love to the man who had waited for her through lifetimes of separation and loss. The ancient mirror in Mara's chambers revealed more than her reflection. As she stood before its silvered surface 3 days after Lucian's revelation, the glass began to shimmer like water disturbed by wind. Images formed in its depths, not of the present, but of futures yet unborn, and pasts long buried in the earth of forgotten graveyards. She saw herself standing in a circle of standing stones, power crackling between her fingers like captured lightning. The woman in the vision wore robes of midnight blue, her hair crowned with silver circlet, her eyes blazing with authority that commanded both mortal and immortal beings. This was not the homeless seamstress of Thornwick Village, nor even the confused woman who had awakened in Castle Nightmare. This was someone else entirely, someone Mara was apparently destined to become. "The scrying glass shows what it will," said Elisande from behind her. The servant had become something of a companion over the past few days, answering Mara's endless questions with the patience of one who had lived through centuries of mortal confusion. Past, present, and future flow together in its depths. What do you see? Myself, but not myself, Mara replied, unable to look away from the shifting images. Someone powerful, someone who belongs in this world of magic and shadow. You have always belonged here, Elisande said gently. In every lifetime, you possess the old blood, the heritage of those who walked between worlds when the barriers were thin. Your grandmother knew it, though she may not have understood its full significance. The mention of her grandmother sparked another memory, clearer than any she had recovered thus far. She remembered sitting by candlelight while gentle hands guided hers, informing the precise stitches that would hold both fabric and intention together. Her grandmother had whispered of thread that bound more than cloth, of needles that could pierce the veil between worlds. She was teaching me magic, Mara breathed, understanding flooding through her like warm wine. All those nights of sewing lessons, she was teaching me to weave power into fabric, to create protections and blessings through needlework. Your bloodline carries the gift through the maternal line, Elisande confirmed, though it grows stronger with each generation that embraces its true nature rather than hiding from it. The mirror's surface rippled again, and this time Mara saw the standing stones more clearly. They were not ancient monuments, but something far more significant, a place of power where the boundaries between mortal and immortal realms grew thin. In the vision, she stood within their circle, not as supplicant, but as guardian, protector of secrets that could reshape the world. A sound from the corridor drew her attention, footsteps that did not belong to any of the castle's silent servants. These boots rang against stone with the deliberate tread of those who wished to be heard, who came bearing news that could not wait for proper announcement. Lucien entered without ceremony, his usual composure fractured by urgency. Behind him came a figure Mara did not recognize, a woman of middle years, whose beauty held an inhuman perfection that marked her as one of Lucien's immortal kind. Her hair was silver-white as moonlight, her eyes the deep blue of twilight skies, and her presence filled the room with power that made Mara's skin prickle with recognition. "This is Lady Morgana Ashworth," Lucien said without preamble. "She brings word from the conclave." The name struck Mara like a physical blow, though she could not say why. Images flashed through her mind, a great hall filled with beings of terrible beauty and ageless wisdom, herself standing before them in chains of silver and shadow, accusations falling like rain upon stone. "You remember," Lady Morgana observed, her voice carrying the music of wind through crystal chimes. "Good. It will make what follows less difficult to explain." "The conclave knows of our reunion," Lucien continued, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "They have not forgotten the prophecies that spoke of your return, nor the threat they believe you represent to the established order." Mara sank into the chair before her dressing table, overwhelmed by the weight of revelations that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. What prophecies? What threat could I possibly represent? 3 days ago I was sewing patches for copper coins. 3 days ago you had not begun to remember who you truly are, Lady Morgana said, settling gracefully into the chair opposite her. "The prophecies speak of the Bride of Shadows, she who will unite the mortal and immortal realms under a single crown. They speak of power that could remake the world according to her will." "That's ridiculous," Mara protested, but even as she spoke, the mirror behind her began to glow with soft silver light. The reflection it showed was not of a mortal woman, but of someone crowned with starlight, whose very presence commanded the attention of kings and creatures of legend alike. "Is it?" Lucien asked quietly. "You have always been drawn to healing broken things, to mending what others would discard. What if that instinct extends beyond fabric to the fundamental fractures between our worlds?" The moonstone pendant at her throat grew warm, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. As it did, Mara became aware of something she had not noticed before, threads of power that connected everything in the room. She could see the magical foundations that supported the castle, the bonds of loyalty that tied the servants to their master, even the ancient love that stretched between herself and Lucian like a silver cord woven through the fabric of time. "I can see it," she whispered in wonder. "The connections, the patterns. It's like needlework, but made of light and intention instead of thread." Lady Morgana leaned forward with sudden interest. "Show me." Without conscious thought, Mara reached out with senses she had never known she possessed. The room filled with visible threads of power, shimmering networks that revealed the true structure of reality beneath its mundane surface. With the same instinct that had guided her needle through fabric for 20 years, she reached out and touched one of the threads. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The candle flames throughout the room flared higher, burning with colors that had no names. The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, showing glimpses of distant places and impossible realms. Even the stones of the castle seemed to hum with renewed vitality. "Extraordinary," Lady Morgana breathed. "Your power awakens faster than it did in previous incarnations. The prophecies may have underestimated the scope of your abilities. What does the Conclave want?" Lucian demanded, though his eyes never left Mara's face as she continued to explore her newfound awareness. "They want her bound," Lady Morgana replied bluntly. "Contained, made safe. There are those among us who believe that preventing the prophecy is worth any price, including the destruction of your beloved." The threads of power Mara had been touching suddenly turned sharp as razors. The room filled with crackling energy that spoke of danger approaching from multiple directions. In the mirror, she saw riders moving through the night toward Castle Nightmare, figures cloaked in shadow, whose very presence seemed to drain light from the world around them. "They come tonight," she said, her voice carrying new authority. "The Conclave sends hunters." Lucian's expression grew deadly, his ancient power rising in response to the threat. "Then they will find that I am not the only one who has grown stronger over the centuries." But Mara was no longer listening to their conversation. She was staring at the mirror, watching visions of possible futures unfold, like pages in a book written by fate itself. In some, she saw herself fleeing into the mortal world, living and dying as she always had, while Lucian faced the Conclave's wrath alone. In others, she stood beside him as battles raged between forces that could reshape the very foundations of existence. And in one future that burned brighter than all the rest, she saw herself wearing a crown of starlight, while both mortals and immortals knelt before a throne built from the reconciliation of opposing forces. The choice Lucian had offered her was no longer simply between mortality and immortal love. It was a choice between the safe obscurity she had always known and a destiny that could change the world forever. The riders were growing closer, and time was running out. The crimson rose that bloomed in the castle's moonlit garden held secrets older than written history. As Mara walked among the impossible flowers that thrived in eternal twilight, she found herself drawn to this particular bloom, a creation of such perfect beauty that it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. When she reached out to touch its velvety petals, the flower's glow intensified, responding to her presence with an awareness that spoke of ancient magic. "The roses of Nightmare bloom only for those whose hearts are pure," Lucian said, emerging from the shadows between the garden paths. Even in the soft light cast by luminous flowers, his face bore the strain of the past day's revelations. Lady Morgana's warnings had set preparations in motion throughout the castle, servants moving with urgent purpose as defenses both magical and mundane were strengthened. "And if my heart is not pure?" Mara asked, watching as other roses began to glow in response to her presence. The entire garden was awakening, flowers opening to release fragrances that spoke of summer nights and eternal love. Then they would wither at your touch, he replied, moving to stand beside her. As they did for the last 3 members of the conclave who visited this place, the roses are more honest than any judge or jury. They see the truth that lies beneath surface intentions. The implications of his words sent a chill through her despite the garden's warmth. If the conclave members who had come before harbored dark intentions, what did that say about those who now rode toward Castle Nightmare under cover of darkness? "Tell me about the prophecies," she said, settling onto a bench carved from living stone that seemed to grow from the earth itself. "Lady Morgana spoke of the Bride of Shadows, but you have shared little of what that truly means." Lucian remained standing, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains where storm clouds gathered despite the clear sky overhead. "The prophecies were written by the Oracle of Delphi in the final days of the ancient world," he began, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "She spoke of a time when the barriers between mortal and immortal realms would grow thin, when old powers would stir and new alliances would be necessary for survival. A wind that smelled of rain and distant lightning stirred the garden, causing the roses to chime like crystal bells. Mara pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders, though she suspected the chill came from within rather than from any external source. The oracle saw a woman who would bridge those realms, Lucian continued. One who carried the blood of both worlds in her veins, who could speak to mortal hearts and immortal souls with equal authority. She would take as consort one of the ancient powers, and together they would reshape the foundations of existence itself. "A rather grandiose destiny for a seamstress," Mara observed, though her tone lacked its usual skepticism. The awakening of her abilities over the past days had shown her that the impossible was merely another word for truths not yet understood. "You have never been merely a seamstress," Lucian said, finally turning to face her. In the rose's glow, his features seemed carved from marble touched by starlight. "In every incarnation, you have sought to heal what others would abandon. As Isabella, you established hospitals for the poor. As Sister Margaret, you tended plague victims when others fled. As Lady Catherine, you negotiated peace between warring clans. Always, you have been drawn to mend what is broken." The crimson rose at her side pulsed brighter, and suddenly Mara could see the threads of power that connected not just the castle, but the entire region. They stretched like a vast web across the countryside, touching every village, every heart, every soul that dwelt within hundreds of miles. Many of the threads were frayed or broken entirely, speaking of divisions that had grown deeper over generations. "I can see it," she whispered, overwhelmed by the scope of what her enhanced vision revealed. The fractures between communities, between beliefs, between the world as it is and as it could be. So much pain caused by simple misunderstanding. "And you feel compelled to mend those fractures, do you not?" She did, with an intensity that took her breath away. The broken connections called to her like torn fabric, demanding repair, like wounds that needed gentle tending. The seamstress in her recognized the pattern of rents that could be closed with the right thread, the proper technique, the patient application of skill developed over lifetimes. "The conclave fears this impulse," Lucian said quietly. "They have grown comfortable with the current order, with the clear divisions between mortal and immortal authority. They see change as threat rather than opportunity." "And what do you see it as?" He moved closer, kneeling beside the bench so that his eyes were level with hers. "I see hope. For the first time in centuries, I see the possibility of a world where love is not constrained by the accidents of birth or the limitations of mortality, where the gifts of both our kinds can be shared for the betterment of all." The intensity in his voice stirred something deep within her chest, a recognition that went beyond memory or conscious thought. She had loved this man across lifetimes, had chosen him again and again despite the cost. But this felt different, not just personal affection, but a shared vision of what they might accomplish together. "The riders approach," she said, Though she had not consciously checked the scrying abilities that had awakened within her, the knowledge simply appeared in her mind like words written on familiar parchment. "Yes," Lucian confirmed, rising fluidly to his feet. "3 members of the Conclave's enforcement division, along with a dozen bound servants who have no choice but to obey their commands. They carry weapons forged specifically to harm our kind, and wards designed to contain magical abilities." "Our kind," Mara repeated, noting his phrasing. "You speak as though I have already chosen transformation. Have you not?" His question held no pressure, no demand for immediate commitment. It was simply an observation based on what he had witnessed of her awakening power and growing understanding. Mara considered the question seriously, examining her heart with the same care she had once devoted to intricate embroidery. The homeless woman who had accepted charity bread from Agnes the baker felt like a stranger now, someone she had worn like an ill-fitting garment. The confusion and fear that had dominated her first days in Castle Nightmare were fading, replaced by a sense of rightness that grew stronger with each passing hour. "I think," she said slowly, "that perhaps the choice was made long ago, and I am only now becoming conscious of it." The crimson rose beside her bloomed fuller, its petals unfurling to reveal depths of color that had no names in mortal tongues. Other roses throughout the garden followed suit, until the air filled with light and fragrance that spoke of promises kept and destinies embraced. "Then we face what comes together," Lucian said, extending his hand toward her. As Mara took his cold fingers in hers, she felt the final barriers around her heart dissolve like morning mist. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever opposition the Conclave might bring, she would meet them not as a confused mortal woman, but as someone finally coming into her true inheritance. The storm clouds on the horizon drew closer, carrying with them thunder that sounded remarkably like the hoofbeats of approaching horses. But in the garden of impossible roses, surrounded by light born from love made manifest, Mara felt ready to face whatever darkness the night might bring. The transformation had already begun, written in flowers that bloomed for truth, and witnessed by stars that had watched their love story unfold across the centuries. The blood crystal that Lady Morgana placed upon the table seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it, its dark surface pulsing with a rhythm that matched Mara's heartbeat. As the Conclave riders drew ever closer to Castle Nightmare, this ancient artifact would reveal truths that would shake the very foundations of everything Mara thought she knew about herself and her connection to Lucian. "Before the hunters arrive," Lady Morgana said urgently, "there are things you must understand, secrets that have been kept for your own protection, but which can no longer remain hidden if you are to face what comes next." Lucian stood by the window, his jaw tight with tension that spoke of a man about to lose something precious. "Morgana, perhaps this is not the time. It is precisely the time," she interrupted with the authority of one who had lived through the rise and fall of empires. "She needs to know why. The Conclave truly fears her, why they have spent centuries ensuring her memories remained fragmented with each rebirth." The blood crystal grew warmer beneath Mara's hesitant touch, and suddenly the chamber filled with visions that struck her mind like lightning. She saw herself in a place that existed before memory, before the first human city rose from primordial earth. She wore robes that seemed woven from starlight itself, and power flowed from her hands to shape reality according to her will. But this was not the first of her incarnations, as she had believed. This was something far older, far more fundamental to the fabric of existence itself. "I am not mortal," she whispered, the knowledge flowing through her like ice water in her veins. "I never was." "No," Lady Morgana confirmed gently. "You are Seraphina, the firstborn of the Celestial Court, daughter of the Morning Star before his fall. You chose to descend into mortality not once but 7 times, binding yourself to the cycle of death and rebirth in order to learn compassion for the beings you were meant to guide and protect. The visions in the crystal intensified, showing her memories that had been locked away by her own choice. She saw herself standing before the throne of light, arguing passionately for the redemption of fallen souls. She witnessed her decision to experience mortality firsthand, to understand suffering and loss in ways that purely celestial beings could not. Each death, each rebirth, was part of your education, Lady Morgana continued. You chose to forget your true nature with each incarnation, to live as a mortal woman and learn the lessons that only genuine vulnerability could teach. Lucien's reflection in the window showed a pain so profound it seemed to age even his immortal features. "And I," he said quietly, "was assigned to watch over you, to ensure that no harm came to you during your sojourns in mortality. To love you was never part of the plan." The blood crystal cracked with a sound like breaking thunder, and Mara gasped as another wave of memory crashed over her. She saw Lucien as he truly was, not a vampire lord who had loved her across lifetimes, but Zadkiel, the angel of divine justice, who had been commanded by powers beyond mortal comprehension to serve as her guardian through the centuries. "You fell," she breathed, understanding flooding through her like dawn breaking across a darkened landscape. "You fell from grace because you loved me." "I fell because I chose love over duty," he confirmed, finally turning from the window to meet her eyes. "Each lifetime, I swore I would maintain proper distance. Each lifetime, I failed. The first time you smiled at me as Isabella in that sun-drenched courtyard in Florence, I was lost. By the time you died in my arms, I had already begun the transformation from angel to something else entirely." The implications struck her like physical blows. 7 lifetimes of love, 7 deaths she had mourned, 7 separations that had driven him deeper into darkness, and all of it orchestrated by her own choice to experience mortality. She had been the architect of their shared suffering. "The conclave," Lady Morgana said, her voice heavy with the weight of ancient knowledge, "consists of other angels who were sent to retrieve you both. They fear that your awakening to your true nature will inspire other celestial beings to choose love over obedience, compassion over divine order. They see your relationship as a contagion that could unravel the very structure of heavenly hierarchy." The chamber shook as horses thundered into the castle courtyard below. Through the windows, Mara could see figures in armor that gleamed with more than earthly light, their faces hidden beneath helms that reflected no illumination at all. These were not mortal hunters, but beings whose authority derived from sources that predated human civilization. "And if they succeed in separating us?" Mara asked, though she already knew the answer from the crystal's revelations. "I will be stripped of what remains of my angelic nature and cast into the depths reserved for those who have betrayed their sacred trust," Lucien replied with terrible calm. "And you will be returned to the celestial court, your memories of these mortal lives erased completely. You will resume your position as though none of this had ever occurred." "Until I choose to descend again," Mara said, her voice growing stronger as understanding crystallized into resolve. "Until I remember that there are lessons to be learned in the spaces between absolute order and perfect chaos." The blood crystal pulsed brighter, responding to the power that was awakening within her, not the inherited magic of mortal bloodlines, but the fundamental force that had helped shape existence itself. The pendant at her throat blazed like a captured star, and suddenly she could see the true forms of everyone in the room. Lady Morgana revealed herself as Raphael, the healer, whose own fall from grace was hidden beneath centuries of careful deception. The servants throughout the castle showed their true nature as minor angels who had chosen exile over separation from those they had been commanded to protect. Even the roses in the garden below blazed with celestial fire, marking this place as a sanctuary for beings caught between heaven and earth. "They cannot force me to return," Mara said, rising from her chair with authority that made the very air shimmer with power. "I am Seraphina of the First Circle. My choice to experience mortality was sanctioned by powers that outrank even the Conclave's authority. But they can claim that your choice has been corrupted, Lady Morgana warned. That your relationship with a fallen angel invalidates your original mission. The sound of armored feet on castle stairs echoed through the corridors like a death march. In moments, the Conclave's representatives would breach the chamber's doors, and the confrontation that had been building for centuries would finally begin. Lucian moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers, despite the danger such contact represented. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "know that loving you across all these lifetimes, in all your forms, has been worth any price heaven might demand." The blood crystal shattered completely, its fragments dissolving into motes of light that swirled around them like fallen stars. As the last piece crumbled to dust, Mara felt the final barriers around her celestial nature collapse. Power flooded through her, not the gentle magic she had been learning to wield, but the raw force that had helped kindle the first sunrise and set the dance of galaxies in motion. When the chamber doors burst open to admit figures whose presence made reality itself bend and waver, they found not a confused mortal woman and her vampire protector, but Seraphina of the Morning Light standing beside Zadkiel the Transformed, their combined radiance turning the stone walls transparent as glass. The war for love's right to transcend the boundaries of divine law was about to begin, and heaven itself would tremble before it was done. The obsidian blade that materialized in the lead conclave member's hand drank light from the air around it, its surface reflecting depths that seemed to extend into realms where hope itself went to die. Forged in the fires that had consumed Lucifer's rebellion, it was one of only 7 weapons capable of severing an immortal soul from existence entirely. The sight of it made even Seraphina's newly awakened celestial nature recoil with instinctive terror. "Gabriel," she said, recognizing the archangel beneath his armor of starlight and shadow. His beautiful features were marred by an expression of righteous certainty that brooked no possibility of mercy or understanding. "I should have known the Conclave would send you to retrieve their wayward daughter." "Seraphina of the First Circle," Gabriel replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made the castle stones ring like struck bells. "By the authority vested in me by the Throne of Light, I command you to abandon this charade and return to your appointed place in the celestial hierarchy." Behind him stood 2 other figures, whose presence filled the chamber with conflicting energies. Michael, the warrior, bore a sword of flame that cast dancing shadows on the walls, despite producing no actual light. Uriel, the herald, carried scrolls that contained the original laws governing interaction between celestial and mortal realms, laws that Seraphina's choices had apparently violated beyond redemption. "My mission was sanctioned by powers beyond your authority," Seraphina replied, stepping forward despite Lucian's protective instinct to shield her from their attention. "I chose to experience mortality in order to understand the beings we were created to guide. Nothing in that mandate prohibited me from learning to love them. Your mission," Gabriel said with cold precision, "was to observe and learn, not to become corrupted by the very weaknesses you were meant to study. Your repeated deaths were acceptable losses in service of greater understanding. Your contamination of a guardian angel was not." The obsidian blade in his hand pulsed with hungry eagerness, and Seraphina felt the weapon's nature with senses that extended far beyond mortal perception. It had been used before she could taste the residual agony of angels who had been erased from existence for the crime of choosing love over absolute obedience. "Zadkiel's transformation was his own choice," she said, moving to stand beside Lucian despite the danger such proximity represented. "I did not seduce him from his duty. I simply existed, and he chose to value that existence over abstract principle." "A choice that damned him," Uriel interjected, unrolling one of his scrolls with a sound like thunder across distant mountains. The laws are clear, intimate contact between guardian and protected leads inevitably to corruption of divine purpose. You have both violated the fundamental order that maintains stability across all realms of existence. Lucian stepped forward, his own power manifesting as wings of shadow that spread wide behind his shoulders. The darkness they cast was not an absence of light, but its transformation into something that embraced rather than illuminated. "Then perhaps your fundamental order requires revision," he said quietly. "If love is corruption and compassion is weakness, what manner of paradise are you protecting?" Michael's flaming sword blazed brighter, its fire reflecting off his golden armor with intensity that would have blinded mortal eyes. "Paradise exists because of order, not in spite of it. Your blasphemy compounds your original sin, fallen one." The confrontation balanced on the edge of violence, but Serafina could see deeper currents flowing beneath the surface hostility. In Gabriel's perfect features, she glimpsed something that might have been longing carefully suppressed. Michael's grip on his sword was too tight, speaking of battles fought within as well as without. Even Uriel's scrolls trembled slightly in hands that had once penned love letters to mortals whose names were now forbidden to speak. "You fear us," she realized with sudden clarity, "not because we threaten heaven's stability, but because we represent the possibility of choice, the chance that divine beings might decide for themselves what gives existence meaning." "We fear nothing," Gabriel replied, but his voice lacked the absolute conviction that had marked his earlier pronouncements. "We serve order. We preserve the structures that prevent chaos from consuming all that has been built across eons of careful planning. Do you?" Lady Morgana Raphael stepped from the shadows, where she had been gathering power for what all present understood would be a battle that could reshape the foundations of reality. "Or do you serve fear itself? Fear that angels might discover they were meant to grow beyond unquestioning obedience. Fear that love might prove a stronger foundation than law." The chamber filled with tension that made the air itself seem to thicken and writhe. Each being present commanded forces that could level mountains or raise new stars in distant skies. The slightest miscalculation could trigger destruction that would echo across multiple planes of existence. But Serafina was no longer the confused mortal woman who had stumbled into supernatural romance. 7 lifetimes of experience had taught her to read the hearts of others with precision that transcended words or actions. She could see the cracks in their certainty, the doubts they carried like secret wounds. "Michael," she said gently, addressing the warrior directly, "do you remember Lydia, the mortal woman who died defending her children during the siege of Jerusalem? You held her as she passed, and for 3 days afterward you refused to take any assignment that might require you to witness such suffering again." The archangel's perfect composure flickered, and his flaming sword dimmed momentarily before blazing back to full intensity. "Mortals die. It is their nature. Sentiment does not change cosmic law." "And Uriel," Serafina continued, her voice carrying the authority of one who had stood at the right hand of creation itself. "The poet in Alexandria who wrote verses that moved you to tears. You preserved every word he ever wrote, didn't you? They're hidden in your personal archives. Read and reread during the lonely hours between official duties." Uriel's scrolls crackled with energy as his control wavered. Poetry serves no divine purpose. It was archived for historical completeness, nothing more. "Gabriel," Serafina said finally, turning to face the leader of their opposition, "tell me about Elena." The name struck the archangel like a physical blow. For a moment his perfect features cracked to reveal the pain that lay beneath eons of practiced composure. Elena, a mortal woman whose faith had burned so purely that it had caught the attention of heaven itself. Gabriel had been sent to observe her, to understand the nature of devotion that transcended earthly concerns. Instead, he had fallen in love with her radiant spirit, her unwavering belief in goodness despite the cruelties she faced daily. "Elena is dead," Gabriel said, his voice barely above a whisper. She died believing her prayers were answered, never knowing that her guardian was a coward who lacked the courage to reveal himself. She died knowing she was loved. Serafina corrected gently, "You think I don't remember, but I was there when you carried her soul across the threshold between worlds. I saw how tenderly you held her, how you whispered promises that no one else was meant to hear." The obsidian blade in Gabriel's hand began to shake, its hungry darkness wavering, as the Archangel's absolute certainty crumbled like sand castles before incoming tides. "You condemned yourself to eternal separation rather than risk corrupting her with your love," Serafina continued. "But what if your love was not corruption? What if it was exactly what she needed to fulfill her own divine purpose?" "Enough!" Gabriel's cry shattered several windows, but the blade he raised trembled so violently he could barely maintain his grip. "We did not come here to debate theology or rehash old wounds. You will return with us willingly, or you will be dragged back to face judgment for your crimes against cosmic order." "And if we refuse?" Lucian asked, his shadow wings spreading wider as he prepared for battle. Michael's answer came not in words, but in action. The warrior's flaming sword swept through the air, carving a line of fire that separated the opposing forces. Where the flames touched stone, the ancient walls began to smoke and crack. "Then you will be destroyed," Michael said with grim finality, "and your souls will be erased from the memory of existence itself. Choose quickly, exile is still preferable to annihilation." Serafina felt the weight of decisions settling upon her like a mantle woven from starlight and shadow. 7 lifetimes of experience had led to this moment, when the choice between love and law would determine not just her own fate, but the future of every being caught between heaven and earth. Around her, power gathered like storm clouds pregnant with lightning. The obsidian blade thirsted for angel blood, while her own awakened nature blazed with the authority that had helped kindle the first dawn. Whatever happened next would echo through eternity, reshaping the relationship between divine will and personal choice for all who came after. The final battle was about to begin, and neither side could afford to lose. The golden chalice that materialized at the center of the chamber blazed with light that existed before the first star learned to burn. Sacred beyond mortal comprehension, it was the cup of binding, the vessel through which the fundamental laws governing love between immortal beings had been written at the dawn of creation. Its appearance transformed the standoff into something far more significant than a simple battle between opposing forces. The cup of binding, Gabriel breathed, his obsidian blade lowering fractionally as recognition dawned in his perfect features. How is this possible? It was sealed away after the War of Heaven, hidden where no being save the throne itself could call it forth. Serafina felt power flowing through her that transcended even her awakened celestial nature authority, that reached back to the moment when love itself had been woven into the fabric of existence. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "it was never meant to remain hidden. Perhaps it was simply waiting for someone willing to challenge the assumption that law must always triumph over love." The chalice pulsed with rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of creation itself. Around its rim, symbols appeared and vanished, like thoughts too profound for permanent expression, representations of every love that had ever existed between beings of divine origin, including those that had been forbidden, suppressed, or destroyed by cosmic law. Lucian moved to stand beside her, his shadow wings folding protectively around them both, as he stared at the artifact with wonder and growing understanding. "It's beautiful," he whispered, and in his voice was the echo of Zadkiel, the angel of justice, who had once helped craft the very laws they now sought to change. Michael's flaming sword flickered as doubt warred with duty in his warrior's heart. The cup was sealed for good reason, he said, though his conviction seemed to weaken with each word. The love it represents led to chaos, to rebellion, to the sundering of perfect order. Did it? Seraphina challenged, extending her hands toward the chalice. Light flowed between her fingers and the sacred vessel, creating connections that revealed truths hidden for millennia. Or did it lead to growth? To the recognition that love is not weakness, but the force that gives meaning to existence itself. The chalice began to sing, a harmony that resonated through dimensions beyond mortal perception. As its music filled the chamber, the walls became transparent, revealing not just the castle grounds, but multiple planes of existence layered one upon another like pages in an infinite book. Mortal realm, celestial sphere, and the spaces between all became visible, connected by threads of light that pulsed with the rhythm of countless hearts beating in unison. "Look," Seraphina commanded, her voice carrying authority that none present could resist. "See what your rigid order has wrought." The vision that unfolded showed heaven as it truly was, a realm of perfect beauty and absolute sterility, where angels moved through their eternal duties with the mechanical precision of clockwork figures. No laughter echoed through crystal halls, no spontaneous joy brightened faces that had forgotten how to smile, no love warmed hearts that had been trained to value order above all else. But in the spaces between worlds, in the hidden corners where divine law held less sway, other angels had chosen differently. Seraphina showed them Raphael, teaching mortal healers the deeper mysteries of medicine, sharing knowledge that had saved thousands of lives. She revealed Chamuel secretly answering the prayers of lovers separated by war, facilitating reunions that gave meaning to empty lives. She displayed Sechil blessing merchants who showed kindness to the poor, ensuring their prosperity would fund acts of charity for generations. "This is corruption?" she demanded, her voice rising with each revelation. "This connection to the beings we were created to guide and protect? This willingness to bend rigid law in service of compassion?" Gabriel's obsidian blade trembled in his grip as the weight of accumulated evidence pressed against everything he had been taught to believe. "Order preserves the structure of existence," he said, but the words came out hollow, mechanical, as though he spoke from habit rather than conviction. "Order serves existence," Seraphina replied, "but it does not define it. Love gives existence meaning, and meaning gives existence purpose. Without purpose, even the most perfect order becomes nothing more than beautiful emptiness." The golden chalice pulsed brighter, and suddenly every being in the chamber could feel the connections that bound them to every other conscious entity across all planes of existence. Mortal and immortal, angel and human, all were part of a vast web of relationship that transcended the artificial boundaries cosmic law had sought to maintain. Uriel's scrolls began to smoke as the words written upon them, laws carved in absolute stone for eternity, started to rewrite themselves. The herald stared in shock as prohibitions against love transformed into guidelines for its expression, as rigid commandments became gentle suggestions for growth. "The laws are changing," he whispered in wonder. "The fundamental structures are adapting, evolving, becoming something new." The battle that had seemed inevitable moments before was transforming into something else entirely, not a conflict between opposing forces, but a choice between holding to the past or embracing a future where love and law could exist in harmony rather than opposition. The phoenix feather that descended from nowhere floated between the opposing forces like a fragment of living flame, its iridescent surface shifting through colors that had no names in any earthly language. Symbol of rebirth and renewal, it represented the possibility that even the most fundamental structures of existence could be transformed through willing sacrifice and love's triumph over fear. Gabriel stared at the feather with something approaching desperation, his obsidian blade wavering as the implications of its presence became clear. "This ends here," he said, but his voice lacked the absolute conviction that had marked his earlier pronouncements. We cannot allow cosmic law to be rewritten based on the desires of two fallen beings. Can we not? Seraphina asked gently, reaching toward the phoenix feather with fingers that blazed with celestial fire. Or are you afraid that rewriting those laws will reveal how many angels have been living lies, pretending perfect obedience while their hearts yearned for something more meaningful than endless duty? As her fingers closed around the feather, power exploded through the chamber in waves that made reality itself ripple like water disturbed by stones. The cup of binding rose from the table, floating in the air between them, as its golden surface reflected not light, but pure intention, the desire to transform, cosmic law from restriction into guidance, from prison into foundation for growth. "I choose love," Seraphina declared, her voice carrying across dimensions to reach every conscious being in existence. Not as weakness, not as corruption, but as the force that gives meaning to existence itself. "I choose Zadkiel not despite his fall from grace, but because of his courage in choosing love over fear." Lucian stepped forward, his shadow wings spreading wide as he made his own declaration. "And I choose Seraphina not as guardian to protected, but as equal to equal, soul to soul. If this choice damns me to annihilation, then I accept that fate gladly, rather than live an eternity empty of love's meaning." The phoenix feather began to glow with inner fire, and where its light touched the golden chalice, ancient symbols blazed to life, representations of bonds that transcended mortal understanding, connections that reached across death itself to unite souls in harmony, that enriched rather than diminished their individual natures. Michael's flaming sword guttered and nearly died, as the warrior felt something he had not experienced in millennia: doubt about the righteousness of his cause. "This is madness," he whispered, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. "Law exists to prevent chaos, to maintain the structures that keep existence stable across all planes of reality. Does it?" Raphael challenged, stepping forward with power crackling around her healer's hands. "Or does law exist to serve love, to create frameworks within which conscious beings can grow and flourish? Look around you, Michael. See what rigid adherence to unchanging law has produced. The chamber filled with visions of heaven, as it had become a realm of such perfect order that nothing new could ever emerge. Where angels moved through their appointed tasks with mechanical precision, where the joy that had once filled crystal halls with music had been replaced by the deadly silence of absolute compliance. But the phoenix feather's influence spread beyond the chamber, beyond the castle, beyond the mortal plane itself. Throughout the celestial spheres, angels, who had long suppressed their own desires for connection and meaning, felt something awakening in their hearts. The possibility that they might choose growth over stagnation, love over mere duty. Uriel's scrolls burst into flame, but instead of being destroyed, they transformed. New words appeared in fire upon their surfaces, laws rewritten to acknowledge that love between conscious beings was not corruption, but the highest expression of divine will. That connection and growth were more valuable than static perfection. "The throne itself approves," Uriel gasped in wonder as he read the transforming text. "These changes carry the authority of the source of all law. We have been enforcing restrictions that were never meant to be permanent." Gabriel's obsidian blade cracked down its length, its power to destroy immortal souls, weakening as the fundamental nature of existence itself shifted around them. "This cannot be," he said desperately. "If love is permitted to triumph over law, if angels are allowed to choose their own paths, then heaven becomes what it was always meant to be." Seraphina finished gently. "A place where conscious beings grow in wisdom and compassion, where love strengthens rather than weakens divine purpose, where joy and wonder replace mechanical compliance." The cup of binding descended toward their joined hands, its golden surface reflecting faces that blazed with the light of transformed understanding. As Serafina and Lucian grasped it together, power flowed through them and into the fabric of reality itself, not destroying the old laws but transforming them, making them living things that could grow and adapt as consciousness itself evolved. The phoenix feather dissolved into motes of pure light that swirled around them like fallen stars, each particle carrying the promise of renewal, of transformation, of love triumphant over fear. When the light faded, they stood before beings who were no longer their enemies but fellow travelers, on a journey toward understanding what divine will truly meant. The cosmic order had been reborn, and love had proven itself not weakness, but the strongest force in existence. The wedding crown that materialized above Mara's head was wrought from materials that existed beyond mortal comprehension: silver that had been spun from moonbeams during the first night, moonstones that held the light of stars yet unborn, and delicate tracery that seemed to grow rather than be crafted. As it settled upon her brow with the gentle weight of destiny fulfilled, it marked not just her union with Lucian, but her acceptance of a role that would reshape both mortal and immortal realms for generations to come. The great hall of Castle Nightmare had transformed once again, but this time the change was permanent and profound. Where once supernatural beauty had seemed otherworldly and separate from human experience, now it blazed with welcoming warmth that invited rather than intimidated. Angels who had opposed them stood alongside the couple, their faces radiant with understanding that had come through trial and revelation. Gabriel, his obsidian blade replaced by a staff of living light, stepped forward to address the assembled witnesses. "By the authority vested in me by powers that transcend individual will," he said, his voice carrying harmonies that spoke of joy rather than duty, "I recognize the union of Serafina the Reborn and Zadkiel the Transformed. May their love serve as foundation for the new age that dawns with this moment." The words held weight that echoed across dimensions, formalizing changes that had already begun to ripple through both celestial and mortal realms. In villages throughout the countryside, mortals who had lived their entire lives crushed by despair found themselves touched by hope they could not name. In the crystal halls of heaven, angels discovered that laughter was not forbidden but welcomed, that joy could exist alongside duty. "You realize," Lucian said softly as they stood before the assembled witnesses, "that accepting this crown means accepting responsibility for bridging worlds that have been divided since time began. It will not always be easy. Mara though she was, Serafina now, in truth as well as memory, smiled with the wisdom that came from 7 lifetimes of experience in loving despite loss. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," she replied. "But we will not face those challenges alone." Around them, the other fallen angels who had chosen love over rigid obedience stepped forward to pledge their support. Raphael, no longer hiding her true nature behind the guise of Lady Morgana, offered her gifts of healing to mend the wounds that centuries of separation had carved between communities. Chamuel emerged from shadows where he had hidden his unauthorized assistance to star-crossed lovers, ready now to serve openly. Sachil, Raguel, and dozens of others who had been serving in secret exile revealed themselves as allies rather than outcasts. Even Michael and Uriel, though they had not fallen as completely as the others, showed signs of transformation. The warrior's flaming sword now burned with light that protected rather than threatened, while the herald's scrolls contained laws written in language of guidance rather than prohibition. "The villages will need time to adjust," Serafina observed, her enhanced vision showing her the threads of connection that now linked every settlement within hundreds of miles. Where once those threads had been frayed or broken, they now glowed with renewed strength. Mortals, who have lived their entire lives believing themselves forgotten, will struggle to accept that they are valued. "Then we will teach them gently," Lucian replied, his shadow wings folding to reveal that they were no longer pure darkness but shadow threaded through with silver light. We will show them through actions rather than proclamations that love creates strength rather than weakness. The transformation was not limited to supernatural beings. Throughout Thornwick Village and the surrounding countryside, changes were already manifesting. Agnes the baker found her bread rising higher and lasting longer, infused with blessings she did not understand but could feel in every loaf. Father Benedict discovered that his prayers were being answered with unprecedented clarity, his church becoming a beacon of hope that drew pilgrims from distant lands. Even Garrett the merchant, despite his earlier cruelty, found his business prospering as genuine fairness replaced his calculating greed. But it was in the quiet moments between public ceremonies that the true measure of their victory could be seen. Serafina and Lucian walked through gardens where impossible roses bloomed in harmony with earthly flowers, where the eternal twilight had given way to natural cycles that honored both day and night. The castle's servants, revealed now as minor angels who had chosen exile over separation from the mortal realm, moved through their duties with joy rather than mechanical precision. "Do you think it will last?" Serafina asked as they stood together on a balcony overlooking the transformed landscape. Below them, the village of Thornwick showed signs of prosperity that went beyond material wealth. Children played in streets where laughter had been rare, couples walked hand in hand without fear of judgment, and even the stones of ancient buildings seemed to glow with contentment. "Nothing lasts forever in its original form," Lucian replied thoughtfully. "But the foundation we have built, the recognition that love serves divine purpose rather than opposing it, that will endure in forms we cannot yet imagine." The wedding crown upon her head pulsed gently, connecting her to every conscious being within her growing sphere of influence. She could feel their hopes, their fears, their gradual acceptance that perhaps the world was becoming something better than it had been. The homeless woman who had once mended torn cloaks by candlelight had become a queen, whose subjects included both mortals and immortals, whose realm encompassed earth and sky. "There will be challenges," she said, though her voice held no fear of what lay ahead. "Other conclaves in distant realms who will resist these changes. Mortals who will prefer familiar suffering to unfamiliar hope. Angels who will struggle to adapt to freedom after eons of absolute obedience." "Yes," Lucian agreed, taking her hand as stars began to appear in the darkening sky above them. "But we will meet those challenges together, as we were always meant to do." The wedding crown blazed briefly with light that could be seen from the farthest villages, a beacon announcing that the age of separation between divine and mortal love had ended. In its place had come something unprecedented in the history of existence, a time when love would serve as the foundation for law rather than its victim. As they turned to re-enter the castle that was now their shared home, Serafina caught sight of her reflection in a window. The homeless seamstress was gone, but what had replaced her was not something alien or distant. Instead, she saw herself as she truly was, a being capable of infinite love, who had finally found her way home. The transformation was complete, and a new chapter in the relationship between heaven and earth had begun.